Hello and welcome back to the History 2020 lecture series here at East Tennessee State University. In the lecture today, I want to talk to you about the decade of the 1960s in terms of the domestic reform agendas of Presidents John F. Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson. Specifically, we'll look at the rise of liberalism with the agenda of the New Frontier and the Great Society. We will examine the different roadblocks facing both plans. We'll also address the ways in which Lyndon Johnson was able to push much more of the Great Society programs through Congress. We'll also evaluate the Great Society and discuss its accomplishments as well as its failures. And then finally, we'll discuss the emergence of a sustained and powerful civil rights movement. The 1960s served as the pinnacle for American liberalism, thanks in part to the reform agendas of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. They viewed themselves as heirs to the New Deal legacy, and they intended to follow in the footsteps of Harry Truman, who as president had desegregated the American military and had secured federal funds for such things as urban public housing, education, and public works projects. Both Kennedy and Johnson believed in the power of the federal government to positively reform American society, but each faced intense resistance from conservatives who were certain that the less the government interfered in the economy or society, the better. Many social ills that had been festering for decades suddenly forced their way onto the national agenda. In the election of 1960, there was little awareness that dramatic change was on the horizon. The presidential election of that year featured Republican candidate Richard M. Nixon against Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. Nixon was better known than Kennedy because of his 8 years as Eisenhower's vice president. Nixon had also developed the reputation of being a cunning chameleon at times. American liberals strongly disliked Nixon because of his ties to HUAC and the McCarthyism era. Nevertheless, Kennedy lacked experience and exposure. Despite a record of heroism in World War II, a Harvard education, and a wealthy family, Kennedy's record in the Senate was at best mediocre. Despite being Roman Catholic, which at the time was considered a political liability, Kennedy was able to secure the 1960 Democrat nomination on the very first ballot. His youthfulness and young, beautiful family appealed to many Americans. In fact, a University of Nebraska student said of Kennedy, quote, "All at once you had something exciting. You had a guy who had little kids and who liked to play football on his front lawn." Yet many middle-aged, middle-class voters tended to like the stability and security of Eisenhower's middle way, promised by Nixon. The turning point in the presidential campaign came when Nixon agreed to debate his less prominent opponent on television. During the first 4 debates, some 70 million voters saw Nixon, who was still weak from a recent illness, perspiring heavily and sporting a 5 o'clock shadow. Nixon looked haggard, uneasy, and even sinister at times before the camera. Kennedy, on the other hand, projected a confident, cool poise that made him seem equal, if not superior, to Nixon in terms of fitness for the office. It's interesting to note that those who just listened to the debate on the radio thought it was a draw between the two, while the far more numerous television viewers declared a Kennedy victory. After the debates, Kennedy's poll numbers shot up, and Nixon never really recovered from his poor showing during the debates. Kennedy also benefited from an economic recession in 1960, as well as from his choice of a Southern Protestant, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. The election of 1960 was the closest since 1888, with only about 120,000 votes separating the two candidates. In the end, though, Kennedy was declared the winner. As Kennedy took the oath of office, he declared, quote, "Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike. The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans." Additionally, Kennedy told the nation in his inaugural address, "Let us begin anew," setting the tone of hope that inspired young people and liberals throughout the nation. He continued on by saying, quote, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, the frontier of unfulfilled hopes. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus." After 8 years with the moderate Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower in the White House, Kennedy wanted to invigorate the liberal agenda through a legislative program that he called the New Frontier. Kennedy specifically focused on the frontier metaphor as the label for his domestic program because Americans had always been courageous adventurers, eager to conquer and exploit new frontiers. He proposed reforms including raising the minimum wage, reducing overcrowding in schools, ending poverty, and providing health care for the elderly. Kennedy also advocated cutting taxes and increasing government spending to stimulate the economy, reasoning that as incomes rose, more tax revenue would flow into the federal coffers to help pay for these programs. As the youngest elected president in American history, Kennedy's charisma and idealism inspired many baby boomers who were just reaching adolescence or entering college. Thousands rushed to join what was called the Peace Corps, an agency established by Kennedy that sent recent college graduates to work on humanitarian projects overseas in developing nations. And by the end of the decade, over 10,000 Peace Corps volunteers had traveled abroad to teach, build hospitals, set up water treatment plants, and establish irrigation systems. Kennedy succeeded in raising unemployment and Social Security benefits, as well as the minimum wage, but he had trouble implementing the other parts of his liberal legislative program. Only about a third of Kennedy's proposals became law, mostly due to his lack of experience or skill in lobbying individual legislators. Conservative congressmen balked at using deficit spending to fund the tax cuts and programs that Kennedy proposed. Southerners also objected to Northerners' insistence that federal education funds only go to racially integrated schools, while Protestants resisted offering public monies to private Catholic parochial schools. As the New York Times wrote, quote, "It was one of the great ironies of American politics. JFK, the immensely popular president, could not reach his legislative goals." More than any other president of the century, except for perhaps the two Roosevelts and then later Ronald Reagan, Kennedy made his own personality an integral part of his presidency and a central focus of national attention. Nothing illustrated that more clearly than the tragedy of November 22, 1963. Kennedy had traveled to Texas with his wife Jackie and Vice President Lyndon Johnson for a series of political appearances. While the presidential motorcade rode slowly through the streets of Dallas, shots rang out. 2 bullets struck the president, one in the throat and the other in the head. He was rushed to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the crime later that day. 2 days later, as Oswald was being transferred between holding facilities, Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner, murdered Oswald. Most Americans at the time accepted the conclusions of a federal commission, which was appointed by President Johnson and chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren, which found that both Oswald and Ruby had acted alone, that there had been no overall conspiracy to murder President Kennedy. Yet in later years, many Americans came to believe that the Warren Commission had ignored evidence, which pointed to a broad conspiracy behind the murders. Controversy over the truth about the Kennedy assassination continues even until this day. When Lyndon Johnson assumed the office in the wake of Kennedy's assassination, he took up the slain president's liberal agenda. "Let us continue," President Johnson proclaimed, echoing Kennedy's earlier appeal, "Let us begin." So now let's take a closer look at the Johnson administration. Unlike Kennedy, Johnson excelled at forging the deals needed to move legislation through Congress, and under his stewardship, liberalism gained tremendous momentum. Over the next few months, Johnson skillfully used the nation's grief to a great political advantage by coaxing Congress into enacting key pieces of Kennedy's legislative initiatives, which included civil rights legislation, a tax cut, and federally funded public housing. Johnson also announced his own war on poverty. He also formed the Job Corps to teach inner-city youth vocational skills. Also, he created Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, a domestic Peace Corps that sent privileged young adults to work on community projects in impoverished rural and urban areas. Despite legislative successes, Johnson knew that for millions of Americans, in his own words, he says, "For millions of Americans, I was still illegitimate, a pretender to the throne, because he'd not been elected president." So Lyndon Johnson saw the 1964 election as an opportunity to validate his presidency. And during the campaign, Johnson spoke of creating what he called a great society with social welfare reforms that would make the amenities of modern life available to all Americans. These amenities included such things as a decent standard of living, education, health care, and clean water. Johnson explained that his domestic program rested on abundance and liberty for all. He said the Great Society demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we are fully committed in our time. Like the turn-of-the-century progressives and the 1930s New Dealers, Johnson wanted to use the power of the federal government to rein in the wealthy and help economically disadvantaged Americans. Having started his congressional career as an avid New Dealer in the 1930s, Johnson shared FDR's desire to provide the deserving poor with a decent standard of living. Johnson, however, believed even more strongly than previous generations of liberal reformers in the ability of the government to improve the quality of life in America. Barry Goldwater, a conservative Republican senator from Arizona who was running against Johnson in the 1964 election, offered a radically different view of what responsibilities the government should assume. Instead of more government, Goldwater proposed dismantling most of the New Deal programs, including Social Security. And he also opposed federal civil rights laws because he saw them as a first step towards creating a police state. Goldwater spoke for the radical right, staunch conservatives who felt that the government's interference in the economy and society did more harm than it did good. However, Goldwater's extreme conservative views alarmed many prominent moderate Republicans who openly supported Lyndon Johnson. As a result, Johnson won the election with over 61% of the popular vote, the largest percentage of any presidential candidate in American history. The Democrats also widened their control of Congress, further strengthening Johnson's hand. And Johnson knew that he had to strike immediately in order to enact his legislative agenda. So now let's look a little closer at his domestic program called the Great Society. Reflecting liberal faith in the power of the government to do good, the Great Society hoped to remove the causes of debilitating poverty by improving the nation's education system, providing health care to the aged and the poor, and creating a new cabinet-level position in housing and urban affairs to oversee housing and economic relief for struggling cities. Johnson's Great Society also included a new Department of Transportation to manage the federal funds pouring into highway construction and landscaping. And Johnson worked very hard to create a consensus for his liberal ideas. For instance, he offered conservative industrialists tax breaks in return for supporting his social welfare programs, arguing that his programs would create highly skilled workers who consumed more. He told the industrialists, quote, doing something about poverty is economical in the long run. From his long years in Congress, Johnson knew how to lobby individual legislators and subjected them to what became known as the Johnson treatment. This was a mixture of cajoling, horse trading, and intimidation. And one congressman recalled that the 6-foot Lyndon Johnson grabbed him by his coat lapels, pulling him very close and holding his face just inches away while he talked. And that was the Johnson treatment. Johnson succeeded in pushing through over 65% of his proposals, a level of success only surpassed by FDR's 80% legislative passage rate. Republicans, unable to stop the Great Society legislation, complained of what they called the 3B Congress, bullied, badgered, and brainwashed. Kennedy had also long fought for federal aid to public education, but he had failed to overcome two main obstacles. Many Americans were afraid that aid to education was the first step towards federal control of the schools. And also Catholics insisted that federal assistance must be extended to not only public schools, but to parochial schools as well. Johnson was able to manage to circumvent both of these objections with the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was passed in 1965, and this legislation extended aid to both public and parochial schools. The aid, however, depended on the economic conditions of the students and not on the needs of the schools themselves. After pushing for federal aid to schools, Johnson then turned to providing health care to senior citizens and to the poor. For the first time since the 1930s, the federal government took steps in the 1960s to create important new social welfare programs. The most important of these, perhaps, was Medicare. Medicare was a program, and still is a program, that provides federal aid to the elderly for medical expenses. Facing strong opposition from health insurance companies and medical professionals to the government-provided health care, Johnson was able to forge a compromise. Medicare reimbursed doctors and hospitals whatever they charged senior citizens instead of establishing government rates. It also avoided the stigma of welfare in that benefits were offered to all elderly Americans regardless of the need. In 1966, Johnson steered an additional health care program through Congress called Medicaid. This extended medical assistance to welfare recipients and other poor peoples of all ages. To secure its passage, Johnson agreed to let the states, and not the federal government, run Medicaid. Closely tied to the anti-poverty program were federal efforts to promote the revitalization of decaying cities. The Housing Act of 1961 had offered almost $5 billion in federal grants to cities for the preservation of open spaces, the development of mass transit systems, and subsidizing middle-income housing. Then in 1966, Johnson established a new cabinet agency called the Department of Housing and Urban Development. In creating the Great Society, Johnson wanted to restore America's identity as the land of opportunity for immigrants. To that end, he supported the Immigration Act of 1965, which eliminated the quota system. If you'll remember, this was established back in the 1920s, and it set stringent caps on immigration from, particularly from Southern and Eastern European countries, and it barred all Asian immigration altogether. In the first great wave of immigration since the 19-teens, unprecedented numbers of Koreans, Chinese, Filipinos, and Vietnamese migrated to the United States over the next 30 years. Whether immigration benefited or hurt the nation once again became a topic on which Americans offered several competing visions. So now let's look at the legacy of the Great Society. Taken together, the Great Society reforms meant a significant increase in federal spending. For a time, rising tax revenues from the growing economy nearly compensated for the new expenditures. In 1964, Johnson managed to win passage of the $11.5 billion tax cut that Kennedy had first proposed in 1962. The cut increased the federal deficit, but substantial economic growth over the next several years made up for much of the revenue initially lost. Critics from both the left and the right attacked Great Society programs. For instance, the left advocated redistributing corporate profits more equitably throughout society. Meanwhile, the radical right denounced the Great Society as what they called a hodgepodge of programs that humiliated the poor and encouraged dependency on government welfare. Johnson also was unwilling to raise taxes to pay for an exploding array of domestic programs, and a costly war in Vietnam also contributed to its undoing. Essentially, the war on poverty ended up being as disappointing as the war in Vietnam. Often, funds that were appropriated for a program never made it through the tangled bureaucracy to the needy. The Great Society helped reduce the number of people living in poverty, but it did so largely by providing federal welfare payments to individuals and not by finding people productive jobs. And as the economy began to overheat, interest rates doubled, the national debt exploded, and inflation caused prices to rise without any corresponding increase in wages. Americans reacted with dismay to the sudden decline in the standard of living after several decades of continued prosperity. By 1966, middle-class resentment over the cost and waste of the Great Society programs had generated a conservative backlash, one that we'll later see played out through a conservative movement. So now let's turn our attention to the battle for racial equality. The nation's most important domestic initiative in the 1960s was the effort to provide justice and equality to African Americans. It was the most difficult commitment, the one that produced the most obstacles in American society. And it was also the most urgent. Black Americans were themselves ensuring that the nation would have to deal with the problems of race. John F. Kennedy had long been sympathetic to the cause of racial justice, but he was hardly a committed crusader. His intervention during the 1960 campaign to help win the release of Martin Luther King Jr. from a Georgia prison won him the support of blacks. But like many presidents before him, he feared alienating Southern Democrat voters and congressmen. Kennedy's administration set out to contain the racial problem by expanding enforcement of existing laws and supporting litigation to overturn existing segregation statutes, with the hopes that making modest progress but without creating any kind of damage or political divisions within the party. But the pressure for more fundamental change could not be contained any longer. For example, in February 1960, black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, staged a sit-in at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter. In the following weeks, similar demonstrations throughout much of the South forced many merchants to integrate their facilities. In the fall of 1960, some of those who had participated in the sit-ins formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which worked very hard to keep the resistance alive. In 1961, an interracial group of students working with the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, began what they called Freedom Rides. Traveling by bus throughout the South, the Freedom Riders tried to force the desegregation of bus stations. And in some areas they met with such violence at the hands of enraged whites that the president finally dispatched federal marshals to help keep the peace. Kennedy also ordered the integration of all train and bus stations as a result. In the meantime, SNCC workers began spreading out into black communities and even into rural areas to encourage blacks to challenge the obstacles to voting that the Jim Crow laws had created. Also, continuing judicial efforts to enforce the integration of public education increased the pressure on national leaders to respond to the civil rights movement. For example, in October 1962, a federal court ordered the University of Mississippi to enroll its first black student, James Meredith. Governor Ross Barnett, an outspoken segregationist, refused to enforce the order. When angry whites in Oxford, Mississippi began rioting to protest the court's order, President Kennedy sent federal troops to the city in order to restore peace and to protect Meredith's right to attend the university. Events in Alabama in 1963 helped bring the growing civil rights movement to something of a climax. In April that year, Martin Luther King Jr. helped to launch a series of nonviolent demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama. The city of Birmingham was probably the most committed to segregation, partly because Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor supervised a brutal breakup of the peaceful marches. Connor arrested hundreds of protesters, and in the process he used attack dogs, tear gas, sometimes he used electric cattle prods and fire hoses to break up the demonstrations. And at times, some of these methods were used on children who were also protesting peacefully. Much of the nation watched these televised reports in horror. 2 months later, Governor George Wallace, who incidentally won election in 1962, pledging staunch resistance to integration, stood in the doorway of a building at the University of Alabama to prevent a court-ordered enrollment of several black students. Only after the arrival of federal marshals and a visit from Attorney General Robert Kennedy did Governor Wallace finally give way. But Wallace's stand won him great popularity among whites throughout the nation who were growing very uncomfortable with the pace of integration. That same night, NAACP official Medgar Evers was murdered in Mississippi. These events in Alabama and Mississippi were a warning to the president that he could no longer contain or avoid the issue of race. In a national television address the night of the University of Alabama confrontation and the murder of Evers, Kennedy spoke of what he called the moral issue facing the nation. And he said, quote, "If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?" A few days later, Kennedy introduced a series of new legislative proposals prohibiting segregation in public accommodations, that is, in stores, restaurants, theaters, hotels, and so forth. He also proposed legislation which would bar discrimination in employment. To generate support for the civil rights movement, more than 200,000 demonstrators marched down the Mall in Washington, D.C. in August 1963 and gathered before the Lincoln Memorial. This march was unprecedented as the largest demonstration for civil rights in the nation's history. President Kennedy at first opposed the idea of the march, but then later gave it his approval after receiving promises from organizers that they would not criticize his administration. It was also here that Martin Luther King Jr. gave one of the greatest and best-known speeches of his career. He kindled the excitement of the crowd with a litany of images prefaced again and again by saying, "I have a dream." The March on Washington was the high watermark of the peaceful, interracial civil rights movement. With the growing momentum of the civil rights movement, leaders now shifted its focus to voting rights during the summer of 1964. Civil rights workers, black and white, northern and southern, spread out throughout the South to work on behalf of black voter registration. The campaign was known as Freedom Summer, and it produced a violent response from some Southern whites. 3 of the first freedom workers to arrive in the South, 2 whites and 1 African American, were brutally murdered by the Klan members. A year later, in March 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. helped organize a major demonstration in Selma, Alabama, in order to press the demand for the right of blacks to register to vote. Selma Sheriff Jim Clark led local police in a brutal attack on the demonstrators, which, as in Birmingham, received graphic television coverage. In the process, 2 northern whites were murdered in these demonstrations. The national outrage that followed the events in Alabama helped push Lyndon Johnson to propose and win passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Better known as the Voting Rights Act, it provided federal protection to blacks attempting to exercise the right to vote. As important as these gains were, they failed to satisfy the rapidly rising expectation of African Americans as the focus of the movement began to move from political to economic issues. For decades, the nation's African American population had been undergoing a major demographic shift. By the 1960s, the problem of racial injustice was no longer primarily Southern and rural as it had been earlier in the century. By 1966, nearly 69% of American blacks were now living in cities, and 45% were living outside of the South. Although the economic condition of much of American society was improving, the poor urban communities in which the black population was concentrated, things were getting significantly worse. Well over half of all American non-whites lived in poverty at the beginning of the 1960s, and black unemployment was twice that of whites. By the mid-1960s, therefore, the issue of race was moving out of the South and into the rest of the nation. Many African American leaders were demanding that the battle against job discrimination move to a new level as well. They called for employers not only to abandon negative measures used to deny jobs to blacks, but also they should adopt positive measures to recruit minorities, thus compensating for past injustices. President Johnson gave his tentative support to the concept of what we now call affirmative action in 1965. And over the next decade, affirmative action guidelines gradually extended to all institutions doing business with or receiving funds from the federal government. The problem of urban poverty was thrust into national attention when violence broke out in black neighborhoods in many major cities. The first large race riot since the end of World War II occurred the summer of 1965 in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. In the midst of a seemingly routine traffic arrest, a white police officer struck a protesting black bystander with his club. The incident set off a storm of anger and an entire week of violence in the city. As many as 10,000 people were estimated to have participated in the violence in Watts. 34 people died in the riot, which was eventually brought under control by the National Guard. In the summer of 1966, there were 43 additional outbreaks of racial violence. The most serious occurred in Cleveland and Chicago. And then during the summer of 1967, there were 8 outbreaks, the worst occurring in Detroit, where 43 people died. Televised reports of the violence alarmed millions of Americans and created a new sense of urgency. The riots also created a sense of doubt among many whites who had previously embraced the cause of racial justice only a few years before. Disillusioned with the idea of peaceful change in cooperation with whites, an increasing number of African Americans were turning to a new approach to the racial issue, the philosophy known as Black Power. The Black Power movement suggested a move away from interracial cooperation and toward increased awareness of racial distinctiveness. It was part of a long nationalist tradition among African Americans that extended all the way back to the Marcus Garvey movement of the 1920s. The most enduring impact of the Black Power ideology was instilling pride in African Americans who lived in a society where dominant culture generally portrayed African Americans as being inferior to whites. But the movement also created a deep divide within the civil rights movement. Traditional black organizations that had emphasized cooperation with whites, such as the NAACP, the Urban League, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, now faced competition from radical groups. SNCC and CORE had both begun as relatively moderate interracial movements, but by the mid-1960s, these and other groups were calling for radical and occasionally violent action against racism. Particularly alarming to many whites, as well as many African Americans, were organizations that existed outside the mainstream civil rights movement. For instance, in Oakland, California, the Black Panther Party promised to defend black rights even if it meant violence. The Black Panthers organized along semi-military lines and openly wore weapons. In Detroit, a once obscure black nationalist group, the Nation of Islam, began to gain new prominence. It was founded in 1931 by Elijah Muhammad, and the movement taught African Americans to take responsibility for their own lives, to live by strict codes of behavior, and to reject any dependence on whites. The most celebrated of the black Muslims, as they were often called, was Malcolm Little, a former drug addict and pimp who had spent time in prison. After Malcolm Little joined the movement, he began rebuilding his life. He adopted the name Malcolm X. The X was to denote his lost African surname. Malcolm X became one of the movement's most influential spokesmen, particularly among younger blacks. His critics claimed he advocated violence, but he advocated that black people had the right to defend themselves violently, if necessary, from those who assaulted them. Malcolm X met a very violent end. He died in 1965 when a black gunman assassinated him in New York. And years after his death, Malcolm X was to many African Americans as important and as a revered symbol as Martin Luther King Jr. was. No decade of the 20th century has created more powerful and enduring images than that of the 1960s. The decade began with the election and then the traumatic assassination of an attractive and energetic young president. John F. Kennedy had captured the imagination of millions and seemed to symbolize the rising idealism of the time. The 1960s also produced a dramatic period of political innovation called the Great Society, which greatly expanded the size and functions of the federal government. The decade also witnessed the emergence of a sustained and powerful civil rights movement that won a series of important legal victories. Yet the peaceful interracial crusade of the early 1960s gradually turned into a much more militant and increasingly separatist movement. As we'll see in another lecture, the decade that began with such high hopes ended with violent division and deep disillusionment.